want to talk about Old Testament narrative. And I'm going to repeat some of the stuff I talked about last week, but we're going to be dealing with enough of Old Testament narrative that I want to focus on it and get y'all used to thinking about how to interpret it. And Caleb, you've seen this before. I'm sorry. You'll just think about Ahab and Eli or whatever. Figure that out. But I think Moses' challenge is he's been up on Mount Sinai. He's seen God. God has revealed all this stuff to him. Then what does he do? How does he convey it? Remember we talked about how do you convey the Big Bang or however the universe started to a bunch of goat herders? Okay? How do you convey that before the universe was, there was God? How do you can say, okay, God is eternal, God is all-powerful, and you can list all these characteristics of God, and the goat herders are going to go, oh, okay, cool. Now, tell me a story. Right? Because they like stories. Stories are fun. Stories are easy to remember. So I think God, or Moses in his inspired wisdom, put all these facts about God in a story. Okay. If you're a Jew and you've just gone into the Promised Land, aren't you going to want to know where you came from? Your history, your heritage, who this God is, how to live with this God? These are all things that Moses is going to try to do. But he's not going to just... If you think this book is bad, wait till you get to your New Testament theology classes. Okay? They're about that. And it's like reading an encyclopedia. How hard is that to remember? Almost impossible. How many of y'all can remember the story of Adam and Eve? If I, backed you up against the wall and said, tell me the story of Adam and Eve, how many could y'all do that? Have you ever thought about how much about God that story tells you? What does that story reveal about God? Think about it for a minute.
God likes obedience.
God demands obedience. Okay, good. What else?
He's a tough God.
Yeah, tough. He's a real God, right? Now, where's my marker? If I'm God, if I hold this marker and drop it, what happens? It falls. If I pick it up 100 times and let go of my fingers 100 times, what happens 100 times? It falls. Is that tough? Or is that just reality?
It's reality.
Just reality. If God says, if you touch the ark, you're going to die. Now, build a fence around it, and then build a fence around that so nobody touches it by accident, and build these long poles so you can carry it. If somebody touches the ark, what happens to them? They die. Is that tough? That's just real. Okay, that's reality. So, yeah, he's an uncompromising God. He's not a mean God. He just says every time you open your fingers, that's going to drop. You don't believe in Jesus? Okay, good. What else?
That every decision we make is ultimately up to us.
Yeah. Free will? Yeah.
I think it shows his love.
Good. His love, certainly. Notice when he kicks him out of the garden, who said love? Sorry, I couldn't. Okay. He still provides for him, doesn't he? Provides clothes for him, all that stuff. God still loves him. What else?
He didn't just wipe him out.
Yeah, merciful. Could have started it all over again. In fact, he told Moses that, I'll wipe out this bunch and raise you up another one.
He set an age limit, so basically gave them mercy. And you can't live like that for forever.
Yeah. How about just the basic idea that God reveals himself?
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Okay? So you'd never thought about the story. Everybody knew the story, but you never thought about what it revealed about God. And I'm convinced that Moses wrote the Torah, first 5 books, the Pentateuch, to tell people about God. So as we go through the story, one of our questions we continually have to ask ourselves is, what does this tell us about God? In the culture of the Old Testament, the oldest son got a double portion of an inheritance, right? How many times does the oldest son get the covenant? Is Isaac the oldest son? Is Joseph the oldest son? Wait a minute. The oldest son's supposed to inherit, doesn't he? Not if God doesn't want him to. You think that's significant? Is God limited by human inheritance rules? No. Okay. So, and this is why I'm saying read stuff slowly, or read stuff with reflection, read stuff with attention. The story is there because it's fun, it's easy to remember, we like it, we can retell it, but the story is also there to reveal. Okay? And in one respect, I mean, the entire Bible. So where does the fall happen? Chapter 3? Yeah. The whole Bible is God's plan, God's story, God's revelation of how He fixes the problem in Genesis 3. The whole Bible is a story. Just different forms and different stuff like that. There's no difference between New Testament and Old Testament. It is the Bible. Everybody go to Revelation 21. Today is Whipsaw Day. It's on page 2065 of my Bible. It doesn't help y'all at all. But. Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There's no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. You know, how do we wind up in the book of Revelation? In the city of God, living with God in a close personal relationship. Right? How do we start out in the Garden of Eden? Living God. The whole Bible brings us back. This is the problem. This is God's solution. This is the end result. Okay? The whole Bible's a story. Why did he tell us all that? Because He wanted to reveal Himself, He wanted to guide us, He wanted to help us, He wanted to encourage us. So we read it enjoying the stories, but we read it because that's also God's revelation. Okay? So, hey Moses, tell me a story. Tell me about Adam and Eve. Tell me about the Easter Bunny. No, he didn't say that. We love stories. So what's your favorite Bible story? Old Testament Bible story. What?
I would definitely say David and Goliath.
David and Goliath. Okay, good. How about another one?
I like Esther.
Esther, yeah. Esther, yeah. Okay, good.
I believe it was Elijah and the prophets of Baal whenever he did that.
Pour some water on that, yeah.
Daniel and the lion's den.
Mm-hmm. Everybody has one, right? Now, as we go through the Old Testament, read your story with a new eye. See what that tells us about God. Who is Goliath challenging?
God.
Yeah, if you read the story carefully, Goliath is challenging God. So what does God do? Does God send a monster against Goliath? No, He sends a shepherd boy. We're talking in the early class about slave girls as kind of an indication of low status. He sends a shepherd boy. Short one. Good looking, but short. And he kills Goliath. Who wins in that battle? God. Okay. So, and there's even more going on there. So they're great stories, but be thinking about what the theological significance of the story is. Okay. We're going to talk about Rahab in a minute. Our tendency is to remember the good and forget the bad. Everybody's favorite story is David and Goliath, right? How many people's favorite story is David and Bathsheba? No, because that's, oh no, don't go there, right? It's not good, it's not pleasant, we don't want to remember. But it's a David story, and we should. So we have to be careful not to ignore the bad stories. The Bible's real. The Bible has good people doing bad things. Now, is that realistic? Do we do that today? Yeah. Can we learn from that story? Yeah. The Bible is full of good, bad examples. It doesn't mean we have to follow them. Right? Solomon was told not to make foreign encumbrances. So he goes, buys horses, and he has lots of wives, all which indicate some kind of foreign encumbrance. Is that good? No. So just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean we do it, because there are some good, bad examples in the Bible. Okay. Narratives and stories show us instead of tell us. They don't say, here are the 12 attributes of God. The story will tell us about those attributes, His power, His mercy, His love. And it's up to us to look behind and say, okay, what do we learn here? And again, just because I say there's stories doesn't mean it's not true. Everybody with me on that? But I would call this theological history in a narrative format. Okay, actually the whole Bible is, even the New Testament. It's history, but it's theological history. It doesn't tell us everything. It tells us what it needs to tell us to make its theological point. We talked about this last week. We don't know everything about Adam and Eve. Right? We don't know how Adam parted his hair or how tall Eve was, because it's not important for the theological subject. But now what that means is when we do get details, we have to say, what is the theological importance of this detail? Okay, so Eve was made from Adam's rib. Okay, what is why are we told that detail? What is the theological importance of that? In some cases there may not be any, particularly when you get to Luke and stuff like that. He just throws in details. But in many cases, the point of the story is in the details. So don't ignore the details. Okay? We don't find meaning behind the text. Now, for a long time as the church was growing up, they did that. It's called the allegorical method of interpretation. And to them, the meaning was not in the text, the meaning was kind of behind the text. It was the allegory. And they would come up with these great, sophisticated meanings where every piece of the story didn't really mean what it meant something else. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, the New Testament, is not really the story about this guy that got ambushed. It's a story about Jesus and the church. Okay, so I mean, the challenge with allegory is you can make a story mean whatever you want it to mean. Okay, so today we don't necessarily do that. We have to be careful because we don't always find meaning in the text. Okay, don't get me wrong, God's inspired word, all that good stuff. But sometimes the text does not mean exactly what it says. Okay, let me try this a different way. I believe that we should read and interpret the Bible literally, except for when we shouldn't. That's a lot clearer, isn't it? We talked about this, didn't we? Does God smell like a sheep and have a big stick? Sure He does. It says so in Psalm 23, doesn't it? Jesus has 7 eyes. Y'all know that, don't you? You've read Revelation. In the book of Revelation, it talks about Jesus having 7 eyes. Now, does that mean He really has 7 eyes? No, it's the 7 spirits and stuff like that. So, yes, I think we should take the Bible literally, except when we shouldn't, when it's poetry or an image or symbolic or something like that. So normally, the meaning will be in the text. The text means what it says, except when it doesn't. Like God being a shepherd and with a big stick, okay? I think where we really find the meaning is in the story. Okay? We find the meaning in the story of Adam and Eve. So why did Moses tell us what he told us in the sequence that he told us? Okay? Could have started anywhere. Could have included all kinds of things. But God inspired him to tell us things in certain ways with certain characters with certain results. And it's up to us to look at that. So let's look at the story of Abraham. But let's also look at the story of Lot. And we see that Abraham in general does things the way God wants him to. Lot in general does stuff the way God does not want him to. Okay? There's a story there. There's a model there. There's a lesson. So we have to say, why does they? Yes, I understand why he gives us the story of Abraham. That's the beginning of the Hebrews and all that stuff. But why continually bounce him off against Lot? I think so we can see the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things and the consequences of doing things the right way and doing things the wrong way. Yes, sir?
It's kind of a point, but is there like a handout for today?
I didn't do that? Yes, there is a handout for today. I thought I put them out on the table.
Thank you.
No, you don't get one. I'm sorry. Y'all got me talking when I came in. It's all your fault. See, I'm shamed, Caleb.
I'm sorry.
No, it's my, no. I did wrong. Okay, I'll steal it back later. You had to have been in the New Testament class to understand.
Just edit that to the front or the beginning of the video.
So, narratives are interesting. They're a whole lot more interesting than reading the 12 characteristics of God. Okay? You include God as a character. If you want God to interact in a narrative, you can have God interacting, can't you? We get to see how characters develop and see how they change. How does Abraham change in his faith journey? It's like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, right? But he always gradually progresses. So that's an encouragement for us. Sometimes the characters are hard to understand. How can Samson show up in the New Testament as one of the heroes of the faith? You know, because Samson is like the poster boy for dysfunctionality, right? I mean, he doesn't get along. I said, we'll get there. Samson's a fun character. But we have to ask ourselves that. Sometimes the story will overshadow the meaning. So we have to be careful not to get excited about the story and miss the meaning. Narratives involve us emotionally. They we enjoy the story without thinking about it. Okay, growing up, can you enjoy the story of Adam and Eve without worrying about whether God really created the world in 7 24-hour periods? Yeah, because it's a good story. Now, from a more mature perspective, we can ask those questions and come up with defenses and stuff like that. But the initial presentation of the story is just a good story. Okay. The example is David gets caught by a narrative. So the prophet comes to David and said, David, I got a problem. Here's a guy that did this terrible thing. What do you think ought to happen to this guy? And David goes, well, put him in a barrel with a monkey and a weasel and roll him down the hill. and the prophet says, well, it's interesting that you should say that because, and then confronts him. Okay, so it's kind of gotten in below David's radar, his defenses, and David has to admit his guilt because he's already said that anybody who did this deserves punishment. Okay? It's always easier to see how the point applies to somebody else. We go, oh, that David, yeah, I knew he was going to come to a bad end. But it's much more difficult when we try to apply it to ourselves. So that's one of the challenges. How do we take this lesson and apply it to ourselves? Jonah, world's first fish story, right? It's a good story. It's easy to remember, but if you really start delving into it, there are all kinds of levels of meaning and lessons learned. I teach a semester-long class in Jonah in Hebrew that we have a great time talking about the story and what it really reveals. Okay? So you have to, it's not just a fish story. What's the purpose of the fish?
Get him back on track.
Yeah? What else? It vomits him up on the land, and then the book actually literally starts over. If you read the 3rd chapter of Jonah, it starts exactly like the 1st chapter. So he gets him back on track. What else does a fish do? Keeps him quiet for 3 days, doesn't he? What's there to do in the belly of a fish? Nothing. Pray, go, okay, God. It's a little quiet time, isn't it? It provides some time for humility, for reflection. Jonah actually winds up praising God. Where does a fish meet God? Where does a fish meet Jonah? When did Jonah and the fish come together? Right after he's been thrown off the boat. Into the middle of this storm, expecting to die. What does the fish do? Rescues him. Who sent the fish? God. And in fact, if you look at the Hebrew, God appointed the fish for the sole purpose of rescuing Jonah from death. Because if you read it, it sounds like Jonah's dying. Giving him quiet time and putting him back on the right track. So is it just a fish story? Or does it tell us stuff about God? Okay. Hopefully you get the picture. Jonah refuses to do what God wants him to do, right? God says, Jonah, go to Nineveh. Jonah says, no, I don't think so. Tarshish, here I come. Now, do we ever do that? Yeah. Rahab is going to Joshua, going to Jericho, getting ready to invade, so they send some spies. It's just, it's almost, like the Bourne kind of thing, whatever that latest spy movie is or whatever. It's a pretty good story, isn't it? They sneak into town, they meet this prostitute, got that little sex thing going on. She shows them around town, she sneaks them out. Well, I'm sorry, there's sex in the Old Testament. I just get over it. I don't complain to your parents, it's in the Bible, it's not my fault. And then she's saved, right? So hey, that's a good story. But what does that tell us about God?
Yeah, he can use anybody.
He can use anybody. Good. What else? Who gets destroyed in Jericho? Everybody?
Except Rahab and her family.
Yeah, exceptions sometimes are important. Why is Rahab not sacrificed or killed?
She did something for God's servants.
Yeah. She recognized God, she acknowledged God, she served God. If you look at the end of the story, she winds up living in the midst of the people. Now, can you do that without becoming Jewish? No. It almost looks like God is going to destroy everybody in the Promised Land except those who want to become Jewish. Is there a message to that story? Perhaps. The story of Rahab is closely followed by the story of Achan. I think it's Achan. Anybody remember that story? This particular city, God says, okay, everything in this city is Korban, dedicated to me. It's all mine. Dogs, cats, chickens, bricks, everything. Destroy everything. And Achan says, well, you know what? God's not going to miss these 3 bars of gold and these 2 silver ingots. So he takes them. He puts them in his tent under the floor or something like that. And God gets mad and starts destroying all of Israel. And they cast lots, and finally they determine that it was Achan who did this, and God kills Achan and his family. Now, 2 stories, pretty close to each other. Rahab, who's supposed to be destroyed, follows God, is obedient, becomes a Jew, and lives. Achan, who's supposed to follow God, becomes disobedient and dies. There's a meaning in those 2 stories? Yeah. And the fact that they're that close to each other, is that significant? Maybe. It looks kind of like it is. So what's the model for us? Rahab, not Achan. Good example, bad example. Okay. So if you look at it as a story and start asking why and how and when and where and all that stuff, I think it becomes more important. 2 different kinds of stories. There's a documentary story that tells us what happened. There's a literary story that tells us how a thing happened. Okay? You can pull theological meaning from both ones, just 2 different ways to kind of do the same thing. So, how do you read a narrative? I never can. We got another 35 minutes. Okay. Is that right? We go to 11:45? Okay. How do you read a narrative? Read it carefully. Pay attention to the details. Our tendency is, because we've heard the story of David and Goliath a bazillion times, just to zip through it. Think about everything you've learned and kind of apply it. Look at the literary context. What happened just before? What happens just after? Okay, because remember, if you're telling a story, you tell it in sequence. And what comes before has an impact on what comes after. So the sequence of things has importance. Right? Examine and notice the sequence of the stories. Notice how the Rahab story sort of interrupts the destruction of Jericho. Now, from a literary point of view, that's just kind of cool because it adds some suspense. Okay? You get to the New Testament, sometimes I think that they use those interruptions to give extra theological meaning. We'll talk about that when we get to the New Testament. So God says, okay, kill everybody in the Promised Land. First chance they have to kill everybody in the Promised Land is the city of Jericho. They kill everybody? No, they don't kill Rahab. Why not? Maybe you don't have to kill everybody in the Promised Land. You just have to kill all the people who aren't willing to obey God and become Hebrews. Okay. And then, if you want to do it in theological terms, faith in God results in salvation and acceptance. Okay. What does disobedience to God do for Achan? Gets him and his whole family killed. And why is it his whole family? That sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? But if you're a tribe, do the actions of one member of the tribe have an impact on everybody in the tribe? Yeah. How much sin can you tolerate in the tribe? None. Is that any different than the New Testament church? Paul in Corinthians uses an Old Testament example talking about leaven in the church, sin in the church, and he says you can't have any. Okay, because it pollutes the whole church. So again, we're not just a Christian, we are Christians. Do the actions of one bad Christian have an influence on all Christians everywhere? Yeah. Okay. Look beyond a single story. We talked about this. Compare Rahab to Achan. And notice it's not that God has different standards. God has one standard: obey me. If you obey Him, are you in good shape? Yeah. I mean, I know there are exceptions, but that's whatever God says to do. Yes, sir. Touch the ark, you're going to die. What happens if you touch the ark? You're dead. So sorry. Told you not to. Told you to make big long sticks. You didn't listen. You're going to die. We'll talk about that when we get to Abraham. I'm sorry, I can think faster than I can talk. How do characters change? How does David change? Early king to late king. Changes a lot. Okay, you look at how does Peter change? At the crucifixion, he's afraid to acknowledge Jesus in front of the slave girl. Pentecost, 2 months later, he's in front of the same people who killed Jesus, and they're telling him, Peter, you stop saying this or we're going to kill you. And he says, I don't care. What God wants is more important than what I want. That's a change. Okay? I think it's the Holy Spirit and the resurrected Jesus. So you see people change. Did Paul change? Yeah. From Saul to Paul? Right. Did Jonah change? I don't know if Jonah changed. Again, if you ask me just flat straight out, I don't think he changed.
He kind of got slapped all the way there.
Yeah. Jonah was very passive aggressive. Well, you can make me go, but... Yeah, I don't think Jonah never liked the Ninevites. But is there a message there? I think so. We probably talked about this. Jericho narrative. Conquest is more than just killing everybody. Okay, the conquest of the Promised Land is about removing the impure influence from the Promised Land. Okay, now that sounds kind of harsh, doesn't it? God's saying, okay, kill everybody in the Promised Land. I mean, doesn't it? I think so. It does sound harsh. But as we go through the Old Testament, watch how this works out. Does God, if we look at the characteristics of God, what we learn from God in the story, does God ever do anything without warning people? Ever. No. In the book of Amos, it says that specifically. God will send a prophet, and God always warns. Do you think God would have warned the pagans in the Promised Land before He sent the people of Israel in to destroy them? Just general characteristics of God. Would that have made sense? Bless you. Yeah. How would He have warned them? So we got Abraham, first Hebrew, right? And very quickly get to Joseph. And he goes to Egypt, and they eventually come back to the Promised Land, right? And I don't know, there's, pick a number, 500 years in there, roughly, okay? And then you've got all the people over here in the Promised Land. They're pagan, they're pagan, they're pagan, they're pagan, they're pagan, and eventually they get driven out of the Promised Land. Is that a fair assessment? Does God ever warn these people? I think He does. Y'all ever heard of Melchizedek? Who is Melchizedek? He's one of the great mystery figures of the Old Testament.
He was a Jewish priest.
Well, he's a priest, yeah. He's a priest in... Good catch.
It's on video.
All right. No, I don't know. He's a priest in Salem. which is really Jerusalem. What kind of priest is he? He's the priest of the Most High God. And who does he relate to? Work with, talk to, receive sacrifices from? Abraham. Now let's think about that. Everybody knows that story, or you can read it. It's just a couple of verses. But think about it. That means 500 years before they're kicked out of the Promised Land, there's a priest of the Most High God, Yahweh, in Jerusalem. What do you reckon he's preaching? Is he preaching Baal? Is he preaching Ishtar? Is he preaching Jojo the dog-headed boy? He's preaching God. What do you think he's talking? What do you think he's saying from God? If you do not obey me, I will send people to destroy you. What does he tell the Israelites before they go into the Promised Land? If you do not obey me, I will send people to destroy you. Doesn't he say that? Over and over and over and over again? And in, 400 or 500 years, what happens? They don't obey him and he sends people to destroy him. Is that a vengeful God? Or is that a God that says, if you open your fingers, this will drop? Okay. So my argument is, these people were warned. And if you trace through Leviticus and Deuteronomy and some of those, you see time and time again the indications, not absolute proof, but the indications that these people were warned. Just like the Jews are warned when they come into the Promised Land. So is this terrible? Yes. But I don't see this as vengeful and mean. I just see this as God saying, if you keep on doing this, there will be consequences. Just like happened to the Hebrews when they got kicked out of the Promised Land, just like happens to us if we reject the Word of Jesus. So, long answer. But I think that follows from the story of Melchizedek. God had a priest. God was revealing himself in the Promised Land 400 years or 500 years before the Jews come back and kick the people out. Now, if everybody in the Promised Land had accepted God as God and followed His law, do you think the post-Exodus Hebrews would have killed them all? Wouldn't have been any reason to, would it? It would just been a reunification of God's people. All right. Stories must have a setting. Stories must have character. Stories must have plot. It's just the way it is, right? Can't have a story without those things. But we have to ask ourselves, why is it in this setting? What are these characters telling us? What do we learn from these characters? And what does the plot tell us? Okay, setting. When and where? So what is about the setting of entering or leaving the Promised Land? Crossing the Jordan, right? When they eventually get ready to cross the Jordan, watch how this story, this is one of those details. The Jordan parts, right? But the Jordan doesn't part until the priests carrying the ark, which is the presence of God, stick their foot in the water. Now, is that significant? Could God have parted the water anytime He wanted to? But He waited for that first step to indicate commitment. Then He parts the water. Okay? So sometimes the setting is important. The Promised Land, by its very nature to Jews, is holy. Okay? The outside is not holy. Look how fast time flows. When the time flow slows down, it's an indication the author wants us to pay more attention. Okay, the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, has been described as a long a passion narrative with a long introduction, because Mark spends so much time on the last week of Jesus' life. Right? He spends, 10 or 11 chapters on 3 years of Jesus' life, and then 4 or 5 chapters on the crucifixion. Why would he do that? It's important. He wants us, there's more stuff to tell there. Okay? Again, think about the geographic character or the geographic setting as we go through. There's all kinds of things we can pick up from the geographic setting. There are certain areas in Israel that are always associated with certain events. Okay, if we're talking about the Jezreel Valley, that's where the enemies of Israel come in from the north. If we're talking about the desert, think about this. What always happens? What can happen in the desert? What encounters do you have in the desert? If you're Jewish, and I say desert encounter, what's the first thing you're going to think of?
Water.
Water? I'm sorry, what? Is it God? Who was with them all during the Exodus? In the wilderness? God, right? Pillar of fire, pillar of smoke. Where does Moses encounter God? The desert. Desert is where you go to encounter God. Now, in addition to that, from the New Testament, what do we think about God? Everybody say, what do we think about the desert? Everybody say Satan. Where's Jesus tested? The desert. So sometimes a setting can have significance. What's significant about a mountaintop from a Hebrew perspective? Moses, Mount Sinai, the law. Their formation as a nation. So if something happens on a mountaintop, you start thinking about some sort of relationship with God or some. So where does Isaac get sacrificed almost? On top of a mountain. Okay, that's an absolute. When we think about top of the mountain in the Isaac story, we just think about the story. If you're Jewish, you think about the whole context of Moses and all that stuff. Okay, when we think about the Lord's Supper, what do we think about?
Just a big table.
Okay, what else? Jesus? Sacrifice? I should have said, when we think about the Last Supper, what do you think about? The disciples and betrayal and dipping the... wrong answer. Well, as Christians, we can't help but do that. But what was Jesus celebrating with his disciples? Passover. And what's the context of the Passover? Egypt, the angel of death passing over based on the lamb's blood sacrifice. So, yes, in one way, absolutely, this is a New Testament ceremony, but it's really based in Old Testament roots. So we can't just think about the Lord's Supper. We really need to think of the whole context of the Passover. It's kind of the same thing, God's protection, but it's God's ultimate protection in the person of Jesus as opposed to God's ultimate protection, the angel of death just going over the lamb's blood on the doorpost. Okay? So you see how these things all kind of... Yeah. So when we read the Old Testament Passover, we need to keep in our mind the New Testament connotation, Last Supper. But when we read the New Testament Last Supper, we've also got to be thinking about Old Testament Passover. Okay? So why does John call Jesus the Passover Lamb? If you don't understand Passover, you don't understand that whole Passover significance. Okay? When you're reading Leviticus, you're going to be bored out of your gourd. It almost rhymes, doesn't it? Okay? You're like, I don't know, why do I care about slitting this lamb? But you need to pick up the importance of the sacrificial system. You need to pick up the importance of blood having to be spilled, a life having to be taken for the sacrifice to be effective. Okay? If you don't understand that, you don't understand why Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. Okay, so I admit Leviticus is not the most exciting book of the Bible. My wife has actually seen people get saved, though, by reading the book of Leviticus. The power of God. Okay. Cultural setting, inside a house or outside. Public or private territory. Big difference. Inside the temple or outside. Again, big difference. All right. The world inside the story can be important. We'll talk more about that later. Plot. What is the sequence of events? How does the author tell us something? What is next to each other? How do things go? Okay? And again, like we were talking about in Abraham and Lot, the story constantly shifts back and forth between Abraham and Lot. Why not just tell us all of Abraham's story and all of Lot's story? I think they're interspersed like that for us to be able to make that comparison. Okay? Think about Jacob and Esau. Okay. They kind of shift back and forth. Think about I don't know what the right word is, I might have used this slide, the reciprocity. or the repetition in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I always get these names wrong. Jacob tricks Isaac and steals Esau's inheritance, right? Did I get all those names right? Okay, good. How does he do that? Because Isaac is almost blind, right? He puts on a goat skin, and I can't imagine your son feeling like goat skin, but whatever. And he tricks him through blindness. Then Jacob has to run away. Jacob has to run away, and he goes to Laban, and he wants to marry Laban's daughter. And what does Laban do? Tricks him in the middle of the night where he can't see. So Joseph tricks through blindness. Joseph is tricked through blindness. Then what happens later on in Joseph's life? He has all these children and they go to Egypt. I'm sorry, Jacob. What happens to Jacob when his sons have the interaction with Joseph in Israel? Jacob is deceived again, isn't he? These names, I get totally confused. But you with me in that? So you see how kind of, this is not karma, but you see these repetitive trends. Okay. How often is sibling rivalry a problem in the Old Testament? Constantly. Do they learn from that? No. Again, I'm sorry. Jacob and Esau have this extreme sibling rivalry, don't they? Okay, but if you read the story carefully, you will see that Jacob, I don't know what the right word is, encourages the sibling rivalry between Joseph and his other brothers. I don't know if there's a real theological meaning behind that, but it's a very human thing. And what you tend to grow up with, you tend to repeat in your children. Okay, so if there's conflict, look at the suspense. How's it resolved? What is the story really about? What is the story? Take the whole story of the destruction of Jericho or the encounter with Jericho. What is that story really about? Is it really about the destruction of Jericho, or is it really about Rahab? Maybe both. I don't know. Or maybe something else. Maybe it's about the encounter with the captain of God's army. So what is the story really about? What is the story of Abraham really about? What is the story of Adam and Eve really about? Is it really about what Adam looked like? No. It's about, I think we said this last week, who did it and what he did. So who created everything? God. What did he do? He created everything. It doesn't, for the purpose of the story, it doesn't matter exactly when or exactly how. Okay? So what is the story about? Who are the characters? How do they change? How do they behave? Are they good examples or are they bad examples? We'd probably beat that to death. Notice that there are consequences. David is a man after God's own heart, right? That's how he's described. But does he escape the consequences of sin? No. In fact, he suffers with them multi-generationally, doesn't he? Yeah. Still God's, I don't know what the right word is. It's still in God's family. God still loves them. Think about the Jews, the Hebrews in the Exodus. God said, okay, you got to die before you go into the promised land. He could have just killed the whole generation right there, couldn't he? Yeah, but no, he loves them. He provides for them as they wandered around the wilderness for 40 years. Okay, they're still his people. They've just missed out on God's fullest blessing. So let's see. In biblical stories, characters are portrayed different ways. We see just direct description. David is a man after God's own heart. We see the responses of others that gives us some clues. We can actually, one of the benefits of a narrative is you can look into somebody's head and see what they're thinking. Okay, so the narrator knows more stuff than the characters involved, and the narrators can share information with us. Now, in the context of the Torah, Moses is a reliable narrator. So we trust what Moses says. We trust it's the truth and we can believe it. And we do that because he's God-inspired. Characters can describe themselves, and actions very often tell us what's happened. Are we ever told that Lot is a bad person? No. What do his actions show us? I think Abraham is 3 steps forward with God and 2 steps back. What is Lot? I don't know, it's maybe, 1 step forward and 2 steps back.
Lot is maybe like a really flawed person, but I don't ever get the feeling like he's a good person.
But he doesn't progress, does he?
No.
Given opportunity after opportunity, rather than moving towards God, he tends to move away. And I think I said this last week, but I mean, there's this great scene where they're up on the mountain and they've decided they have to split their flocks. And God has told his people to go this way. Okay, which is not necessarily the best looking stuff, but that's where God told him to go. Abraham goes that way from the top of the mountain down. Lot goes this way to Sodom. So we see falteringly Abraham continually going where God wants him to. Lot always going where God doesn't want him to. So what's the message there? Oh, we just talked about this. The narrator may make moral judgments and comments. The narrator makes a moral judgment and a comment. You think we ought to look at that? Yeah, that's probably a pretty good clue. Use every relevant detail. Let's see. Identify the exact nature of the plot, convey the story, notice how you just pay attention to the details. I mean, if you read, and y'all ever read fun books? I don't know, mysteries, whatever, yeah. When you're reading the book, you ever read a mystery, try to figure out what's going to happen? Pay attention to the details, look for clues, stuff like that. Read the Bible that way. Now, I'm not taking anything away from the Bible, but I'm just read the Bible asking questions. Why are we told this? Okay, why do Noah's sons get in so much trouble when they see him naked? We'll talk about that. But why is that? Okay, why didn't God just kill everybody with the flood? Why didn't God kill everybody at Mount Sinai? Except Moses. I mean, God, looks Moses in the eye, metaphorically, and says, let me kill this bunch. I'll make you a new one. I mean, that's what he says, isn't it? Paraphrase, but that's what he says. Why would he do that? And again, I'm not looking for an answer now, but when you read it, start paying attention to stuff like that. Now, not all the examples are, going to be earth-shakingly theological in their import. Okay, there's this bald-headed prophet that a bunch of teenage thugs are making fun of him because he's bald-headed, and then shortly bears come out of the woods and eat him. All right, now, why is that? I don't know. So but pay attention and ask questions. So read it with a level of detail, like you're reading a murder mystery or something like that. Be alert for presence of shifts. So again, when Abraham and Lot split, that's it. When Esau and Jacob split, that's an indication too. Okay? Look at how your story influences whether you approve or disapprove of a character. And think about why. Why am I liking this character so much, or why am I disapproving of this character so much?